Imagine walking your child to school, and halfway down the road, they fall asleep standing up. Not tired, not fainting, asleep. You catch them before they hit the ground. You carry them home, and they don't wake up for 3 days. Now imagine this doesn't happen once. It happens to your neighbor, then the woman who runs the shop, then the man who fixes the tractors, then you. An entire town, falling asleep, one by one, and no one can tell you why. This actually happened. It has a location you can find on a map, and for almost 2 years, some of the best doctors in the country walked through this town, ran their tests, and left with nothing. And the town is called Kalachi, and it sits in the north of Kazakhstan, a quiet place, a few hundred people, the kind of town you drive past without noticing. And starting in the spring of 2013, its people began falling asleep. Let me be clear about what this sleep actually looked like, because it was nothing like being sleepy. A person would be in the middle of an ordinary moment, cooking, talking, walking across a field, and without warning, they would go down. Once asleep, you could not wake them. You could shake them, shout at them, sit them up. A local nurse described it perfectly. She said, you wake them, they open their eyes, they can even answer your questions, but the second you stop talking to them, they're gone again. Sleep, sleep, sleep. That was all the body wanted. And they would stay under for a long time. Not minutes, not hours, days. Some slept for 2 days, some for 6. Children were among the worst affected. Kids dropping off at their desks and being carried home, out cold, for the better part of a week. Then there was the part that frightened people the most. When they finally woke up, they were changed. Many couldn't remember anything from before they fell asleep. Some woke up, confused and slurring, stumbling around as if they were drunk, though they hadn't touched a drop. And the hallucinations, this is the detail that turned a medical mystery into something out of a nightmare. People woke describing visions so vivid they couldn't believe they weren't real. One woman said she felt a snail crawling across her face. Children saw things that weren't there and screamed. Grown adults described horses flying, lights, monsters. Their own limbs feeling like they belonged to somebody else. By the time it was over, around 150 people had been struck by it. In a town that small, that's almost everyone, whole families, every age group, and it kept coming back. A wave of sleep would pass through, and the town would go quiet for a while, and then it would return and take a new set of victims. So people did what people do when they're frightened and have no answer. They reached for the explanations that felt big enough to match the fear. Some were sure it was a curse. Kalachi had been a Soviet town, built to serve something nearby, and now it felt like the land itself had turned against them. Others whispered about a mass psychological event, that the fear was spreading from person to person, that people were sleeping because they'd seen their neighbors sleep, and some deep part of the mind had followed. It's a phenomenon, this kind of contagious illness that spreads through belief rather than germs. And with the hallucinations, the drunkenness, the memory loss, it seemed to fit. But there was a problem with the psychological theory, and it's an important one. This sickness didn't only strike people who knew about it, it struck children too young to be frightened by rumors. And here's the detail that breaks it completely. It struck the animals. Cats in the town fell into the same deep sleep. Livestock became sluggish and strange. A cat cannot catch a fear from gossip. Whatever was happening in Kalachi was not in people's heads. It was in the town itself, in the ground or in the air, and that pointed investigators back to the one thing everyone in Kalachi had been trying not to look at. Right next to the town, there was a hole in the ground, and to understand it, you have to go back to the Soviet era. During the Cold War, this region was uranium country. The Soviet Union needed uranium for its weapons and its reactors, and it dug mines to pull it out of the earth. Kalachi existed partly because of one of these mines. It was a working town tied to the rock. Then the Soviet Union collapsed. The mine was no longer profitable, and like so many mines across the old empire, it was simply abandoned. The workers left. The pumps that had kept it dry were switched off, and the tunnels dug deep into the earth were left to whatever came next. What came next was water. With the pumps off, groundwater slowly seeped in and began to flood the tunnels. And this is where a dead mine quietly turned into something dangerous because of a piece of chemistry that sounds almost too simple. Those old mine tunnels were braced with wood, timber supports, holding up the roofs the way mines have been built for centuries. When that wood was left underwater and underground, sealed away from fresh air, it began to break down. And wood breaking down in an oxygen-starved space doesn't rot the ordinary way. It undergoes a slow chemical decay that releases gases. It pulls the oxygen out of the air, and it produces carbon monoxide. Now, carbon monoxide is one of the quietest killers we know of. You cannot see it, you cannot smell it, you cannot taste it, and it is astonishingly good at one specific terrible thing. Your blood carries oxygen using a molecule called hemoglobin. Carbon monoxide binds to that same molecule, but it binds around 200 times more tightly than oxygen does. So when carbon monoxide is in the air you breathe, your blood starts grabbing it instead of oxygen, and it won't let go. Your lungs keep working, your breathing looks normal, unless oxygen is actually reaching your brain. And the brain, starved of oxygen, does exactly what Kalachi described. First confusion, then that drunk, stumbling, slurring state, then hallucinations, then a heavy, unshakable sleep. And in that sleep, if the exposure is bad enough, memory damage. Every strange symptom in that town is a known symptom of the brain being slowly deprived of oxygen. So the official investigation, when it finally came, landed here. The flooded uranium mine was breathing out an invisible mix of gases, carbon monoxide and hydrocarbons, while pulling oxygen from the air. On certain days, when the conditions were right, that bad air would settle over the town. People would breathe it, and they would fall asleep. It even explained why the sickness came in waves and struck some houses harder than others. Because gas moves with the weather, with air pressure, with wind pooling in one place and sparing another. In 2015, the government announced that the mystery was solved. The people of Kalachi were being poisoned by the ghost of the mine that built their town, and the real solution in the end was not medicine. It was to move. The government began relocating the residents of Kalachi to other towns, emptying the place out. No, because you cannot treat a patient whose home is the thing making them sick. Today, Kalachi is nearly a ghost town, not because of a curse, but because its people had to leave the air behind, and that should be the end of it. A clean answer, a dead mine, a simple gas, a town saved by relocation, but if you sit with it a little longer, it doesn't feel quite as finished as the announcement made it sound, because not everyone was satisfied. Other researchers who studied Kalachi pointed out things the carbon monoxide story didn't fully cover. A team from a university in Kazakhstan looked at the pattern of who got sick and argued it looked less like something in the air and more like something in the water. Chemical contamination of the groundwater, possibly from old military barrels left to leak into the earth. They couldn't name the exact chemical. They just said the air theory didn't explain everything they were seeing. Meanwhile, a geochemist from across the border in Russia suggested a different gas entirely. Radon, the radioactive gas that uranium rock naturally gives off and is the real culprit, or at least part of it. So you have three serious explanations of carbon monoxide from the wood, poisoned groundwater, radon from the uranium. And while the government picked one and closed the file, the scientists never fully agreed, which means the honest version of this story isn't mystery solved. It's mystery mostly explained by a place so poisoned in so many overlapping ways that we may never separate one cause from another. And there's something worth staying with in that. We like to imagine that the dangerous places in the world announce themselves, that poison looks like poison, that a threat to your life would at the very least have the decency to be visible. Kalachi is a reminder that this isn't true. The people there were living ordinary lives, walking to school, fixing tractors, running the shop, on top of a slow chemical process none of them could see, in air that looked exactly like clean air. The danger wasn't hiding. It was just invisible, which is worse. There was nothing to be afraid of, right up until you were asleep on the ground and couldn't remember your own children. The reason we invented instruments, the sensors, the meters, the tests, is precisely because our senses were never built to detect this kind of thing. We can see a predator, we can smell smoke, but we have no organ for carbon monoxide, no warning for radon, no way to taste a poisoned well. For almost all of human history, that gap in our senses was survivable because the world hadn't yet filled up with things we can't perceive. Kalachi is what happens at the edge of that gap. A town that did nothing wrong, made sick by something no human body is equipped to notice, and only saved when a machine finally told them what their own senses never could. The mine is still there. The tunnels are still flooded. The chemistry hasn't stopped. Wood is still breaking down in the dark. The ground is still exhaling whatever it exhales. The only thing that changed is that the people are gone. The town went quiet, not because the danger ended, but because we finally admitted we couldn't win against an enemy we couldn't feel. So the next time you walk into a room and feel completely, unquestionably safe, the air still, the ground solid, nothing to fear, remember that safety is a feeling, and feelings were built for a simpler world than the one we made. Most of the time that feeling is right. In a small town in Kazakhstan, for almost 2 years, it was wrong.